America in the early 1950s was drunk on dreams. Neon lights flickered across city streets, radios hummed in every living room, and movie theaters became temples where ordinary people worshipped extraordinary faces. Fame was no longer just admiration, it was obsession. And in the middle of this golden illusion stood two figures who seemed to have everything the world desired, yet privately carried the same quiet ache. Elvis Presley was rising like a storm no one could control. His voice was raw, dangerous, and irresistible. When he stepped onto a stage, crowds screamed as if witnessing something forbidden. To the world, he was confidence embodied, a rebel wrapped in charm. But behind closed doors, Elvis was a young man trapped inside a machine built by managers, contracts, and expectations. Freedom, the very thing his music promised, was something he himself rarely touched. At the same time, Marilyn Monroe was becoming the most recognizable woman on the planet. Her smile filled cinema screens, magazine covers, and fantasies. She was presented as joy, desire, and innocence all at once. But the woman behind that smile lived in constant emotional exile. Every laugh was rehearsed, every pose calculated, every word filtered through what others wanted her to be. The world loved Marilyn Monroe, but very few ever tried to know Norma Jean. What bound Elvis and Marilyn together was not proximity, but parallel loneliness. They lived in the same era, breathed the same air, and were devoured by the same public hunger. Yet their lives moved on separate tracks, close enough to see, too distant to touch. They were icons sharing a stage called history, but neither was allowed to step off and simply be human. Elvis spent long nights awake, surrounded by people yet deeply alone. Fame followed him everywhere, but intimacy never did. Every friendship felt monitored, every relationship evaluated for its impact on his image. Even love came with conditions. In moments of silence, when the noise finally faded, Elvis felt the weight of being owned, not by one person, but by millions. Marilyn's nights were quieter, but heavier. After the applause ended and the camera stopped flashing, she sat with her thoughts and the familiar sense of being disposable. Studios wanted her beauty, men wanted her body, audiences wanted her fantasy, but no one seemed interested in her fears. She searched for affection in the wrong places, hoping someone would see past the surface she was forced to sell. Neither of them knew it yet, but their stories were already intersecting, not in reality, but in emotion. Elvis watched films the way others watched sermons, and when Marilyn appeared on screen, he didn't see a sex symbol. He saw vulnerability. He saw loneliness wearing lipstick. He saw someone who understood the cost of being adored by strangers. This was not love at first sight. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement between two souls who would never meet on equal ground. Elvis felt something he could not name and dared not express. In an industry that controlled his every move, falling for the wrong woman, even from afar, was a risk he couldn't afford. Marilyn, meanwhile, remained unaware. Elvis Presley was just another name in the headlines, another voice on the radio. She never knew that somewhere, behind the noise of his own fame, a man was watching her with something dangerously close to devotion. A devotion that asked for nothing. A devotion that stayed silent. The tragedy of their story lies not in what happened, but in what never did. No letters exchanged, no secret meetings, no whispered confessions. Just distance, restraint, and timing that refused to cooperate. Two icons frozen in their roles, unable to step toward each other without losing everything they had built. This was the era that shaped them and the cage that trapped them, an era where being loved by millions meant being understood by none. And as history marched forward, it carried Elvis and Marilyn in opposite directions, each believing they were alone in a crowded world. What Elvis felt, he buried deep. What Marilyn needed, she never received. And somewhere between those two truths, a love story began and ended without ever being spoken. Elvis Presley's fame did not arrive slowly. It exploded. One moment he was a Southern boy with a guitar and a shy smile, and the next he was a phenomenon America could not stop staring at. His voice shook radios, his movements ignited controversy, and his presence alone felt dangerous to an older generation. Yet the more powerful Elvis appeared on stage, the less control he held over his own life. Every decision, every appearance, every relationship was filtered through people who claimed to know what was best for the product called Elvis Presley. He lived surrounded by noise, screaming fans, flashing cameras, endless interviews, but silence followed him everywhere. Hotels felt like cages, tours felt like routines, and success felt strangely hollow. He could command thousands with a single note, yet he could not choose where to go, who to love, or when to rest. His manager spoke for him, contracts spoke for him, and expectations spoke louder than his own desires. Freedom existed only in his songs, not in his reality. In rare, quiet moments, Elvis searched for escape in films. Movies offered him something his life could not: emotional honesty without consequence. And that was where Marilyn Monroe entered his world. On screen, she was radiant, playful, magnetic. But Elvis noticed something others missed. Behind her laughter, he sensed hesitation. Behind her confidence, he saw fragility. Marilyn did not look powerful to him. She looked exposed. And that vulnerability struck something deep inside him. Elvis never spoke about it openly. Admiring Marilyn was not something he could afford. She was not just a woman, she was an institution, a headline, a risk. Loving the wrong image could ruin everything he had built. So what he felt remained internal, carefully hidden beneath discipline and restraint. He watched her films again and again, not for desire, but for understanding. Marilyn represented the part of himself he was not allowed to show, the insecure, uncertain human behind the legend. While Elvis struggled with control, Marilyn was fighting a different battle. Her world demanded perfection, but offered no protection. Every role she accepted reinforced an image she did not create but was forced to maintain. She was expected to be desirable, cheerful, and uncomplicated, even as her inner life grew more complex and painful. People laughed with her, but rarely listened to her. And as her fame increased, her isolation deepened. Marilyn did not see herself as powerful. She saw herself as replaceable. Each film felt like a test she might fail, each relationship like a temporary shelter that could collapse at any moment.
The pressure to remain Marilyn Monroe left little room for Norma Jean, the thoughtful, anxious woman who longed to be taken seriously. The world applauded her image while quietly ignoring her exhaustion. Unknowingly, Elvis and Marilyn were mirroring each other's suffering. He was owned by his success. She was consumed by hers. He feared making the wrong move. She feared being forgotten. Yet neither reached out because neither believed they were allowed to. Their fame did not connect them, it separated them. In a culture obsessed with spectacle, vulnerability became dangerous. Elvis often wondered what it would be like to speak freely, to love without calculation. But every instinct told him silence was safer. His affection for Marilyn remained private, unacknowledged, and unrealized. He convinced himself that distance was protection, for her, for himself, for everything he stood to lose. Silence became his discipline, and discipline became his prison. Meanwhile, Marilyn continued searching for reassurance in places that offered none. Surrounded by admirers, she felt unseen. Compliments blurred into noise, and attention lost its meaning. What she wanted was not praise, but presence. Someone who saw her fear and stayed anyway. She never knew that somewhere beyond her world, a man understood that fear completely. Time moved forward without mercy. Opportunities passed, chances faded, and the silence between them grew heavier with every year. Elvis's restraint became habit. Marilyn's hope grew thinner. And history, indifferent and impatient, continued writing their stories separately, refusing to let them intersect. This was not a romance shaped by action, but by absence. Not by words, but by the lack of them. Elvis loved in silence because speaking would have shattered the illusion that sustained his life. Marilyn lived unaware because no one ever told her she was truly seen. Between those two truths, something deeply human was lost. By the end of this chapter, both were further entrenched in their roles, Elvis as the controlled king, Marilyn as the misunderstood goddess. Neither realized how close they were emotionally or how far apart they would remain forever. And as the world celebrated their success, the quiet cost of their fame continued to rise, unnoticed and unpaid. Marilyn Monroe woke up every morning knowing the world expected her to be effortless. Effortlessly beautiful, effortlessly charming, effortlessly happy. The mirror never lied to her, but it also never told the whole truth. What stared back was not confidence, but survival. She learned early that vulnerability was only acceptable when it looked attractive, and pain was only tolerated when it could be turned into entertainment. Every role she played on screen slowly erased the woman she was off it. The more famous she became, the less room there was to exist without performance. Hollywood did not create Marilyn's loneliness, but it perfected it. Studios controlled her image, schedules controlled her body, and expectations controlled her voice. She was praised endlessly and listened to rarely. When she spoke seriously, she was dismissed. When she expressed fear, it was labeled weakness. The industry rewarded her silence with applause and punished her honesty with neglect. Over time, she learned to smile even when her mind felt like it was collapsing inward. Relationships offered no refuge. Men approached her as a fantasy, not a person. They desired what she represented, not what she felt. Even when surrounded by affection, she felt emotionally untouched. Love, for Marilyn, became transactional, given conditionally, withdrawn suddenly. She kept hoping that the next connection would be different, that someone would stay long enough to see her clearly. Each disappointment reinforced the belief that something inside her was fundamentally unlovable. At night, when the noise of the world finally faded, her thoughts grew louder. Doubt replayed itself endlessly. Was she talented or just lucky? Was she admired or merely consumed? She questioned her worth constantly, measuring herself against an image she could never fully embody. The very persona that brought her success became the standard she felt she was failing to meet. The gap between Marilyn Monroe and Norma Jean widened with every passing year. Medication became a quiet companion, not for pleasure, but for peace. Sleep did not come naturally anymore, and when it did, it was shallow and uneasy. Anxiety followed her everywhere, even into moments of supposed triumph. Awards, premieres, standing ovations, none of it silenced the fear that she was one mistake away from being discarded. Fame promised permanence, but offered only conditional acceptance. While Marilyn struggled to hold herself together, Elvis Presley watched her descent from a distance, unaware of its depth but sensing its gravity. He read headlines, saw photographs, noticed the changes in her expression. The laughter looked thinner, the confidence more forced. He recognized the exhaustion because he lived with a different version of it every day. Yet recognition did not translate into action. Silence remained his chosen language, even as concern quietly replaced admiration. Marilyn never knew that someone saw past the image without demanding anything in return. No expectations, no contracts, no need for her to perform. If she had known, it might not have saved her, but it might have reminded her that she was understood somewhere beyond the walls closing in around her. Instead, she continued believing that admiration was shallow and affection temporary. The world interpreted her fragility as instability. Delays were labeled irresponsibility. Sensitivity was mocked as weakness. The same traits that made her human were used as evidence that she was difficult, unreliable, replaceable. Compassion was scarce in an industry that thrived on results, not reflection. Marilyn internalized the criticism, letting it confirm her deepest fears about herself. As her career progressed, the pressure intensified. Every appearance felt like a test, every performance a defense. She worked harder, slept less, trusted fewer people. Isolation became routine. Even surrounded by assistants, colleagues, and admirers, she felt profoundly alone. The idea that someone might care for her without needing anything in return felt unrealistic, almost naive. Elvis's silence mirrored her isolation in a cruel symmetry. He believed distance was protection, unaware that absence can wound as deeply as rejection. Marilyn's world grew colder, more mechanical, more unforgiving. She needed reassurance, not applause, understanding, not adoration. What she received instead was scrutiny and expectation, endless and exhausting. Time continued forward, indifferent to her struggle. Projects came and went, headlines shifted, new stars emerged. The industry that once elevated her began quietly preparing to move on. Marilyn sensed it and panicked. The fear of becoming irrelevant haunted her more than exhaustion. She had given everything to become a symbol, and now the symbol felt disposable. By the end of this chapter of her life, Marilyn Monroe was still adored publicly, but privately unraveling. Her smile remained intact for the cameras, but behind it lived doubt, fatigue, and a growing sense of invisibility. She had no idea that somewhere, in another world, equally unforgiving, a man carried a silent understanding of her pain. And as fate continued to keep them apart, the cost of that silence grew heavier with every unspoken truth. Elvis Presley had learned how to control his voice, his movements, even his image, but he never learned how to control what stirred inside him when Marilyn Monroe appeared on a screen or a magazine cover. It was not obsession, and it was not desire in the way the world understood it. It was something quieter and more dangerous: recognition. He saw in her the same fracture he felt within himself, the same exhaustion hidden behind performance. Where others saw glamour, Elvis saw effort. Where others saw confidence, he saw survival. He followed her career without admitting it aloud. Film releases, interviews, photographs, each one felt like a small window into a life he would never be allowed to approach. The industry drew invisible borders around them, reinforced by managers, publicists, and unspoken rules. Elvis understood those borders well. Crossing them meant chaos. Crossing them meant losing control in a life already defined by it. So he stayed where he was, watching from a distance that felt safe, but slowly became unbearable. Silence became his discipline. He told himself it was maturity, responsibility, professionalism. He convinced himself that admiration was harmless as long as it remained unexpressed. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are denied. They deepen, they settle, they attach themselves to meaning. Marilyn became a symbol not of fantasy, but of everything Elvis could not say. She represented vulnerability without apology, pain without disguise. Loving her silently felt like the only honest thing he was allowed to do. Meanwhile, Marilyn continued moving through a world that demanded constant availability and offered no protection. She sensed something missing in her life, something essential she could not name. People came and went. Praise followed criticism. Success alternated with disappointment. She adapted, adjusted, endured. Yet a quiet emptiness remained. The absence of genuine understanding left her emotionally starved, even as her public image overflowed with attention. Elvis sometimes imagined what it would be like to speak to her as a human being, not as a star. No cameras, no expectations, no scripts. Just two people admitting they were tired. But imagination was as far as it ever went. Reality was governed by consequences. A single rumor could destroy careers. A single misstep could rewrite narratives. Elvis knew the cost of visibility, and he refused to let his private feelings become public property. The more he restrained himself, the more his silence shaped him. It hardened into habit. Silence became easier than vulnerability, safer than honesty. He believed he was protecting something sacred by keeping it hidden, unaware that withholding can sometimes be its own form of harm.
Loving without expression slowly transformed into longing, and longing into quiet regret. Marilyn's life, at the same time, grew increasingly unstable. Trust became difficult. Sleep became inconsistent. Confidence fluctuated between extremes. The pressure to maintain her image intensified as her internal strength weakened. She began to feel like a stranger in her own success, disconnected from the person she once hoped to become. Every expectation felt heavier, every criticism sharper. The world that celebrated her beauty showed little patience for her fragility. There were moments when Marilyn sensed that her pain was invisible, dismissed as exaggeration or drama. She longed for someone who would listen without judgment, someone who would stay present without needing her to perform. But such presence never arrived. Each interaction reinforced the belief that affection was conditional, dependent on her ability to remain desirable and compliant. Unbeknownst to her, Elvis felt that absence acutely. He understood what it meant to be valued for an image rather than a person. He understood the loneliness of being admired but not known. And yet, understanding did not translate into connection. Distance remained. Silence persisted. The world continued to spin, indifferent to the emotional parallel unfolding beneath its surface. Time passed quietly, carrying opportunities with it and leaving them unused. Elvis's career expanded, but his emotional landscape narrowed. Marilyn's fame endured, but her sense of stability eroded. Both adapted in different ways, he through control, she through endurance. Neither found relief. The unspoken bond between them existed only in one direction, incomplete and unresolved. Elvis began to sense that silence had a cost,
not immediate, not visible, but cumulative. Each year that passed without acknowledgement added weight to his restraint. He wondered, briefly and dangerously, whether silence was truly noble or simply fear disguised as discipline. The thought unsettled him, but he buried it quickly. Questioning his choices threatened the structure that kept his life intact. Marilyn, on the other hand, moved closer to emotional exhaustion. The gap between her public persona and private reality widened beyond repair. She smiled when required, laughed when expected, and collapsed inward when alone. No one noticed how thin the margin had become. The world assumed she was strong because she appeared beautiful. It mistook endurance for resilience. By the end of this phase of their lives, both were firmly entrenched in roles they no longer fully recognized. Elvis had mastered silence, but lost spontaneity. Marilyn had mastered performance, but lost security. Their stories continued on separate paths, shaped by decisions made in fear and reinforced by circumstance. What connected them remained unseen, unspoken, and unresolved. This was the cruel balance of their existence. Elvis loved her without presence. Marilyn lived without knowing she was understood. And as the years moved forward, that imbalance would become irreversible. The silence that once felt protective would soon reveal itself as permanent, and the cost of that permanence would be paid not in scandal, but in loss. By the late 1950s, the distance between Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe was no longer just physical or professional. It had become structural, almost permanent.
Their lives moved forward on parallel tracks that never intersected, guided by forces larger than personal desire. Fame had matured into an industry, and both of them were no longer rising stars, but established properties. Every move they made was calculated, analyzed, and controlled. In such a system, coincidence had no room to breathe. Elvis's world tightened around him. His schedule grew denser, his responsibilities heavier, and his circle smaller. Trust was rationed carefully. Every interaction carried risk. Every new connection was evaluated for loyalty. The boy who once sang freely had become a man who measured every word. Love, in that environment, felt like a liability. Even the idea of reaching out to anyone, let alone Marilyn, seemed reckless. Silence, once a choice, now felt mandatory. Marilyn's world, meanwhile, began to fracture under its own pressure. Success no longer brought reassurance. Each new project was met with doubt rather than excitement. She felt scrutinized rather than supported, managed rather than understood. The expectations placed on her had grown impossible to meet. Youth was demanded, perfection was assumed, vulnerability was punished. She sensed that the industry's patience with her was thinning, and the fear of being replaced crept closer every day. Both were surrounded by people, yet increasingly isolated. Elvis's entourage protected him from chaos, but also from honesty. Marilyn's assistants shielded her from stress, but also from truth. Real conversations became rare, emotional intimacy even rarer. They existed in environments designed to preserve productivity, not well-being. In such spaces, human connection was considered inefficient. Elvis noticed the shift in how Marilyn was spoken about. The tone of headlines changed. Admiration gave way to concern, concern to criticism. Delays were exaggerated, struggles sensationalized. He felt a tightening in his chest every time her name appeared attached to words like unreliable or difficult. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, how the industry slowly rewrote narratives when someone no longer fit neatly into expectations. He wanted to believe she was stronger than the rumors suggested. He wanted to believe she would find stability, peace, something solid to hold on to. But belief offered no protection. Distance rendered him powerless. Whatever he felt, whatever he understood, remained useless because it was never expressed. Silence stripped his concern of impact. Marilyn, at the same time, grew more inward. Trust eroded, anxiety increased. Moments of clarity alternated with moments of despair. She began to feel like time was working against her, that opportunities were slipping away faster than she could grasp them. The joy that once accompanied attention had vanished. Now attention felt invasive, judgmental, exhausting. She longed for a version of life that did not require constant performance. The irony was cruel. Elvis, who understood her struggle, remained unreachable. Marilyn, who needed understanding, remained unaware it existed. Fate did not intervene. There were no accidental meetings, no shared spaces, no quiet moments where paths crossed naturally. The system surrounding them prevented it. Their worlds were carefully curated to avoid unpredictability. Connection was unpredictable. Elvis's silence began to feel heavier, more consequential. What once seemed like restraint now resembled surrender. He told himself that nothing would have changed even if he had spoken, that reaching out would have complicated lives already strained.
that distance was inevitable. These justifications helped him endure, but they did not erase the sense of something unresolved. Marilyn's exhaustion deepened. She questioned her future, her relevance, her worth. The roles offered to her felt repetitive, diminishing. She fought to be taken seriously, to be seen as more than an image. Each struggle drained her further. The world applauded her resilience without offering relief. She survived, but survival was no longer enough. Time continued its indifferent advance. Seasons changed, careers shifted. The opportunity for connection narrowed until it was barely visible. Elvis's life solidified into routine. Marilyn's life destabilized into uncertainty. Both were moving, but neither was moving towards something healing. This was the moment when distance hardened into destiny. What had once possible, however unlikely, now felt impossible. Not because of a single decision, but because of accumulated silence, delayed courage, and circumstances allowed to solidify unchecked. The space between them became permanent, not through rejection, but through inaction. Elvis would later reflect on this period with quiet discomfort. Not regret exactly, but something close. A recognition that some things are lost not through dramatic failure, but through careful avoidance. Marilyn would never know this reflection existed. She continued forward, carrying her burdens alone, unaware that someone had once seen her clearly and chosen silence instead of reach. By the end of this chapter, the story had shifted irreversibly. The distance was no longer a gap that could be crossed. It had become a defining element of both their lives. Elvis remained controlled, contained, admired. Marilyn remained visible, vulnerable, and increasingly alone. And the world, distracted by spectacle, failed to notice that something quietly human had slipped beyond recovery. By the early 1960s, Marilyn Monroe's life no longer moved in straight lines. It drifted, stalled, and doubled back on itself, as if even time had become uncertain around her. What the public saw were headlines, appearances, fragments of glamour carefully assembled to maintain an illusion of continuity. What existed beneath that illusion was instability, emotional, physical, and psychological. The structure that once held her together was quietly failing, and no one with power seemed willing to stop and ask why. Her days became unpredictable. Some mornings she woke with clarity and determination, convinced she could regain control, rebuild her confidence, and reshape her career on her own terms. Other mornings felt unbearable. Anxiety pressed in before she even opened her eyes. The weight of expectation made breathing feel laborious. She learned to function through exhaustion, to move through discomfort as if it were normal. Hollywood interpreted her inconsistency as irresponsibility, never considering that it might be a signal of distress. Studios grew impatient. Schedules mattered more than well-being. Delays were counted in dollars, not in human cost. Conversations about Marilyn increasingly happened without her. Decisions were made around her instead of with her. The industry that had once molded her into a symbol now debated whether she was worth the effort to maintain. Compassion was quietly replaced by calculation. Medication filled the gaps where rest and understanding should have been. Sleep, when it came, was chemically induced and fragile. Waking felt disorienting. Emotional balance became harder to maintain. She was not seeking escape or indulgence. She was seeking relief. Relief from fear, from pressure, from the constant sense of being evaluated. The line between coping and dependency blurred gradually, unnoticed until it was already crossed. Public perception shifted again. Where there had once been admiration, there was now suspicion. Where there had once been curiosity, there was judgment. Marilyn felt herself becoming a problem to be managed, rather than an artist to be supported. The loss of dignity hurt more than the loss of opportunity. She wanted to be taken seriously, but seriousness seemed incompatible with the image she had been forced to embody for so long. Elvis Presley watched these developments with growing unease. Her name appeared in conversations colored by concern, frustration, and gossip. He recognized the pattern too well. The same machinery that controlled him was now turning against her. The difference was that he had been protected by rigid control, while Marilyn was being abandoned by it. He sensed that she was unraveling, even if he did not know the full extent of her pain. Yet once again, silence prevailed. Elvis remained contained within his own obligations, his own carefully managed world. He told himself that intervening was impossible, that reaching out would change nothing. Distance offered plausible excuses. Silence disguised itself as inevitability. And so he continued to watch, powerless not because he lacked understanding, but because he lacked action. Marilyn's isolation deepened. Trust felt dangerous. People's intentions were difficult to read. Kindness often arrived with conditions. She felt exposed, scrutinized, and profoundly alone. Even moments of success brought little comfort. Applause faded quickly, leaving behind the same unanswered questions. Was she valued for who she was, or only for what she represented? The answer, increasingly, felt obvious. Her attempts to regain control were misunderstood. Efforts to demand better treatment were framed as instability. Sensitivity was labeled unpredictability. The more she tried to assert herself, the more resistance she encountered. It became clear that the system preferred her compliant, not conscious. The cost of awareness was alienation. Physically, she grew tired. Emotionally, she grew numb. The world continued to expect the same radiant performance, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the energy required to sustain it was gone. Marilyn was no longer collapsing dramatically. She was eroding quietly, piece by piece, strength by strength, until even survival required effort. Elvis felt the weight of this erosion without fully understanding it. A vague sense of urgency began to surface, accompanied by an uncomfortable realization that time was not infinite. Silence, once manageable, now felt fragile, but habits are difficult to break, especially when they are reinforced by fear. He remained still while the situation moved towards something irreversible. The tragedy of this phase was not marked by a single event, but by accumulated neglect. No intervention, no pause, no moment where someone with authority chose humanity over efficiency. Marilyn continued forward because stopping felt impossible.
The world continued watching because it was entertained, and the quiet signals of collapse went unanswered. As weeks turned into months, the distance between who Marilyn was and who she appeared to be became unbearable. Maintaining the illusion required more energy than she possessed. She began to withdraw, emotionally and physically, from a world that had taken so much from her and offered so little in return. Hope did not vanish entirely, but it weakened, stretched thin by repetition and disappointment. Elvis's silence now carried a different weight. It was no longer neutral. It was no longer protective. It had become part of the environment that allowed deterioration to continue unchecked. Understanding without response proved insufficient. Empathy without presence proved powerless. By the end of this chapter, the collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a trajectory. Marilyn Monroe was still alive, still visible, still adored in theory. But the foundation beneath her was compromised, and the world around her showed no sign of slowing down. Somewhere beyond her awareness, a man who understood her pain remained silent, and the cost of that silence was approaching its final reckoning. By the time the world began whispering that Marilyn Monroe was in trouble, Elvis Presley already felt it. Not through facts or reports, but through an instinct sharpened by his own confinement. He understood what it meant to be admired while being suffocated, to be protected while being erased. The difference was that Elvis had walls built around him, while Marilyn's were collapsing inward. The realization disturbed him more than he allowed himself to admit. Elvis's life, outwardly stable, had become emotionally stagnant. His routines were flawless, his performances controlled, his image intact. Yet beneath that order lived a growing discomfort. Silence, once a refuge, now felt like avoidance. He replayed moments he never had, conversations he never initiated, choices he never made. For the first time, he questioned whether restraint had been wisdom or fear disguised as responsibility. Marilyn's situation worsened quietly, without drama worthy of headlines. She moved through days with diminishing energy, relying on habit rather than hope. The sense of being unsupported had hardened into expectation. She no longer anticipated rescue or understanding. She simply endured. Each obligation drained her further. Each appearance required more effort than the last. The world saw inconsistency. She felt exhaustion. Elvis followed the news more closely now. Articles grew sharper, less forgiving. Sympathy was conditional, patience limited. He recognized the familiar shift, how quickly admiration curdled into blame.
the system that created icons also destroyed them when they no longer functioned smoothly. He had been spared that phase through strict control. Marilyn was not. A sense of urgency surfaced, quiet but persistent. Elvis wondered whether silence could still be justified. He imagined reaching out, not publicly, not dramatically, but privately, humanly. A message, a gesture, something to break the isolation he sensed closing around her. But hesitation followed immediately. Every possible outcome felt dangerous. Misinterpretation, exposure, consequences he could not calculate. Fear returned, wearing the mask of caution. Marilyn, unaware of this internal conflict, felt herself slipping further from stability.
Her trust in others had eroded to almost nothing. Each interaction felt transactional. She complied because resistance required energy she no longer had. The idea that someone might care without expectation felt increasingly unrealistic. She had learned too many times that affection was temporary and interest conditional. The loneliness became physical. Silence in empty rooms pressed heavily against her. Sleep offered little relief. Waking brought no anticipation. The future appeared vague and uninviting. She was not planning an end. She was struggling to imagine continuation. Survival felt like obligation rather than desire. Elvis's regret took shape slowly, not as guilt, but as awareness. Awareness that silence does not remain neutral forever, that absence becomes a statement of its own. He understood that his inaction was now part of the story unfolding around Marilyn. Understanding without intervention offered no comfort. It only intensified the sense of responsibility deferred. Time narrowed the window further. Opportunities for meaningful connection shrank with each passing day. Elvis felt trapped by his own patterns, unable to move decisively without disrupting the fragile balance of his life. He told himself there would be another moment, a better time. He believed distance still allowed patience. He was wrong. Marilyn's resilience thinned. The strength that once carried her through disappointment was depleted. The role she played no longer distracted her from the emptiness beneath. She felt invisible even while being watched. The contradiction exhausted her. She wanted rest, not escape. Quiet, not attention. Stability, not admiration. The world continued its rhythm, indifferent to her struggle. Schedules were maintained, expectations remained unchanged. There was no collective pause, no recalibration of priorities. Marilyn adapted because she had no alternative. Adaptation became survival. Survival became routine. Routine stripped life of meaning. Elvis sensed that something essential was being lost. Not a career, not an image, but a person. He recognized the signs too late to feel confident, too early to feel resigned. The tension between action and fear intensified. Silence now felt heavy, irreversible. He wondered whether speaking now would even matter. Marilyn never knew any of this. She never knew that someone saw her decline with clarity rather than judgment, that someone understood the cost of being loved for an image rather than a self, that someone hesitated not because he did not care, but because he cared too cautiously. The tragedy lay not in malice, but in restraint stretched too far. As this phase drew to a close, the emotional distance between Elvis and Marilyn reached its maximum, not because feelings faded, but because circumstances hardened. What remained unspoken now felt permanent. Regret settled quietly, unnoticed by the world, but deeply felt by the man who carried it. This was the moment when silence stopped being protection and became loss. Elvis would carry that realization forward, even as events moved beyond his reach. Marilyn would continue forward, unaware of the understanding she never received. And history, blind to the subtleties of restraint and hesitation, would remember only what was visible, not what was withheld.
What the world celebrated as charm and charisma concealed an exhaustion that no one bothered to recognize. She moved through people who admired her beauty, but ignored her pain. The adoration she received was conditional, transactional, never sincere. She was visible everywhere, yet entirely unseen where it mattered. The cameras captured her smile, the lights glorified her image, and the headlines praised her brilliance, but no one addressed the fragility that pulsed beneath the surface. Her struggles were minimized, trivialized, or reframed as eccentricity. Sympathy existed in theory, but practical care was absent. She felt the weight of attention without the support it promised. The world wanted perfection, consistency, and entertainment, but it had no patience for humanity. Elvis Presley watched from a distance, understanding more than anyone could imagine, yet powerless to intervene. He knew the machinery that had elevated both of them would never bend for human emotion. The same forces that celebrated their talent were the ones that isolated them.
He observed the relentless cycles of expectation and disappointment, the pattern repeating itself like a dark tide over which neither could gain control. Every article, every rumor, every photograph that hinted at her instability tightened the grip of inevitability. He saw the warning signs clearly: overwork, exhaustion, isolation, but knew that any attempt to reach her directly would risk exposure, misunderstanding, and personal consequence. So he remained silent, trapped between knowledge and inaction. Marilyn, meanwhile, navigated this world with remarkable persistence. She endured appointments, meetings, shoots, and interviews, all while hiding the growing fragility that her public persona could never betray. The dissonance between performance and reality created tension in every movement she made. It was exhausting and increasingly dangerous. She began to doubt herself more intensely than ever before, questioning every choice, every appearance, every smile. The mask she wore was cracking under the relentless pressure, and she had no confidant willing or able to help her stabilize. Even her closest associates were caught up in the demands of an industry that valued spectacle above survival. Understanding and support were luxuries denied to her. Each day became an exercise in endurance rather than living. Elvis felt the moral weight of his silence. The distance he had maintained out of caution was no longer neutral. It contributed to the isolation surrounding her. He understood that inaction, even with good intent, could have consequences as profound as direct interference. Yet he remained hesitant. Every instinct told him that approaching her or attempting intervention could stabilize his own carefully managed world. Fear disguised itself as responsibility, and he allowed it to dictate behavior that logic increasingly questioned. His admiration had always been private, protective in intent, but it now felt like a missed opportunity with tragic potential. He reflected on what it meant to love someone from afar, fully aware that his restraint might never be undone, that his silence might never be reconciled. Marilyn's health and emotional stability became progressively fragile. The demands of fame accelerated the erosion of her energy. Sleep became intermittent, often chemically induced, never restorative. Anxiety shadowed her constantly.
The pressures of visibility and the expectation of perpetual joy were unbearable, yet no mechanism existed to support her. The very institutions that had profited from her talent left her exposed when vulnerability became apparent. Her life became a balancing act between appearances and survival, each day a test she was increasingly unsure she could pass. She sought comfort in small routines, fleeting moments of connection, yet these were insufficient to offset the cumulative stress of relentless expectation. Elvis internalized the despair he witnessed, carrying it quietly while performing his own obligations. The knowledge of her suffering left him unsettled, aware that time was slipping beyond influence. He imagined reaching out, offering support, expressing concern, but each scenario ended in hesitation. The risk of exposure, misinterpretation, or loss of personal control overpowered his desire to intervene. Silence became both shield and prison, a barrier that protected him yet contributed to her isolation. He recognized the cruel symmetry. He understood her pain, but was confined by his own circumstances, just as she endured the consequences of being misunderstood by the world that adored her. Marilyn's professional obligations continued unabated. Each role required precision, charm, and energy she increasingly lacked. Directors, producers, and coworkers responded to delays and inconsistencies with frustration rather than empathy. The very fame that had once elevated her now amplified scrutiny and judgment. She was both celebrated and endangered by the system that demanded perfection without accommodation. Emotional collapse was not acknowledged until it became visible, and by then it was too late for simple interventions. Small cracks in her support network went unnoticed, magnifying the effects of every misstep or moment of doubt. Elvis watched these events unfold with quiet anguish. He understood the machinery of fame more intimately than anyone else. He knew that the very traits that made Marilyn extraordinary, her brilliance, sensitivity, and vulnerability, also made her a target for neglect in a system that prioritized output over well-being. He knew that her decline was preventable in theory, but untouchable in practice. The irony was bitter. He could see her clearly, understand the danger, yet remain incapable of acting. Each passing day reinforced the tragic lesson that distance and inaction, even with affection, carried weighty consequences. By the end of this period, the distance between awareness and intervention had hardened into inevitability. Marilyn continued performing her life under intense observation, but with diminishing resilience. Elvis remained outside, watching silently, carrying the unspoken burden of understanding,
and the quiet remorse of helplessness. The world applauded what it could see and ignored what it could not. The collapse of subtle support, the absence of unspoken intervention, and the relentless pressure of expectation converged to create a scenario where tragedy became increasingly likely. In this shared orbit, one suffered in full view, the other in quiet complicity, and the system allowed it to continue. By the time 1962 approached, the gap between Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe had transformed from emotional distance into an unbridgeable chasm. They had lived parallel lives, bound by fame, haunted by isolation, and defined by a system that rewarded spectacle but punished vulnerability.
Direct narration. Every decision they made, every public appearance, every forced smile contributed to a narrative they could not rewrite. Elvis remained ensnared in the machinery of his career, meticulously curated, tightly controlled, and publicly celebrated. Marilyn moved through the same world, but without the protections, without the walls, and without the illusion of autonomy that had shielded him. Their silent connection, the unspoken recognition of shared pain, remained intact only in possibility, never reality. Elvis had watched her rise, watched her struggles, and understood them with a clarity that no one else could claim. Yet understanding was powerless without presence. He carried the weight of her isolation in the quiet chambers of his own conscience, but he could not intervene, could not reach across the physical and emotional distance to alter what was already occurring. The irony was cruel. His love was precise, informed, and protective, yet incapable of effect. Marilyn, unaware of the observer of her suffering, continued to navigate a world that misinterpreted fatigue as weakness, vulnerability as instability, and humanity as eccentricity. She moved through schedules, contracts, and appearances with increasing strain, while the public's adoration remained shallow, transactional, and incomplete. Praise and applause could not alleviate the silent erosion of her spirit, nor could they repair the emotional gaps left by isolation. She was celebrated for beauty, charm, and charisma, but her inner life was invisible, unacknowledged, and unsupported. The industry, once an enabler of her rise, now functioned as a prison, demanding performance without consideration, reward without understanding, attention without empathy. Every effort she made to maintain equilibrium consumed resources she no longer had in reserve. She relied on routines, habits, and fleeting moments of private solace to sustain herself, but even these were insufficient to offset the cumulative weight of relentless expectation. Elvis, at the same time, experienced a mirrored burden of restraint. The silence he maintained, which once seemed prudent and protective, had begun to feel morally ambiguous. Observation without action carried consequences. Understanding without presence was complicity. Each day that he remained silent added to the invisible cost, a cost he knew could never be repaid. He pondered whether the very act of inaction had contributed to the fragility he so clearly observed in her life. Yet the rules of his own existence, dictated by management, public expectation, and personal caution, left him immobilized. The space between them, which could have been traversed through a simple gesture, had become untouchable. It was not indifference that defined his silence, nor was it lack of feeling. It was fear, timing, circumstance, and the weight of everything else. A single action could have reshaped outcomes, but it was impossible to know which action, if any, would have been sufficient. Marilyn, in parallel, sensed a deepening emptiness she could not articulate. The attention she received was hollow. The adoration of millions could not substitute for recognition of her true self. She craved understanding, empathy, and emotional safety, none of which arrived in adequate measure. Relationships and friendships faltered under the weight of expectation and the erosion of trust. Her laughter became performative.
Her smile became a tool of survival rather than a spontaneous expression. Every day, she measured herself against impossible standards, unaware that her struggles were mirrored silently by a man who admired, protected, and loved her from afar. The tragedy of their connection lay not in what was present, but in what was absent. Elvis's affection, careful, disciplined, and precise, was forever invisible to her. Marilyn's suffering, profound, escalating, and largely misunderstood, was beyond the reach of his understanding to alleviate. They existed in the same world, breathed the same air, and yet were separated by circumstance, expectation, and fear. The distance between them became a space filled with everything left unsaid. Communication, honesty, and human presence, all potential remedies, remained absent. History, indifferent to nuance, recorded only what could be observed. Two icons, successful, glamorous, adored. But it omitted the quiet tragedies, the unspoken love, the emotional voids, and the isolation endured privately. The audience applauded performances, but overlooked the slow collapse of the emotional lives behind the public image. The narrative of fame was incomplete. It did not account for restraint, absence, or silent understanding. As 1962 drew to its close, the gap between Elvis and Marilyn had solidified into inevitability. Silence, once protective, now functioned as a barrier. Unspoken feelings, unexpressed care, and restrained love had constructed an invisible wall. The emotional space that could have been shared was now defined by impossibility. Elvis, constrained by his circumstances and bound by discretion, watched helplessly. Marilyn, trapped by expectation and misunderstood by all around her, moved forward alone. The culmination of years of restraint, misalignment, and systemic neglect was becoming manifest. The world saw the brilliance, charm, and allure. What went unseen was the fragility, longing, and unfulfilled connection that defined their unspoken story. Their lives continued forward, parallel yet separate, intertwined only in possibility, haunted by the recognition that what could have been would remain forever unrealized. The tragedy of silence, once protective and thoughtful, had evolved into loss. The potential for human connection, for understanding, for shared empathy, had dissipated not through negligence, but through caution and circumstance. Elvis loved her in the way he knew he could, silently, carefully, invisibly. Marilyn, unable to perceive this affection, continued her fragile journey through a world incapable of meeting her emotional needs. The inevitability of their separation, of missed opportunity, and of the quiet consequences of unspoken care had become a defining characteristic of their story. And as the years advanced, the world would remember only the spectacle, the fame, and the glamour, never the invisible bridge that was never crossed, the affection that was never expressed, and the tragedy that remained entirely unseen. By 1962, the world had grown accustomed to the brilliance of Marilyn Monroe and the dominance of Elvis Presley. Their names appeared in every headline, their faces on every magazine, their lives studied, admired, and envied. Yet beneath the lights, the cameras, and the applause, there existed a truth that no one would capture: a silent love, a shared understanding, and a tragedy neither could prevent.
Elvis had loved her quietly for years, observing her from a distance, recognizing her fragility, feeling the weight of her exhaustion, and wishing he could intervene. But the walls around them, walls of fame, expectation, circumstance, and fear, had kept them apart. His affection remained invisible, his care unexpressed, and every attempt to imagine reaching her ended in hesitation. Marilyn, meanwhile, moved forward through a world that demanded constant performance, relentless perfection, and endless charm. She smiled, laughed, captivated millions, and was adored publicly, yet privately she crumbled under pressures no one could see. She longed for understanding, for someone to see past the image, for a touch of authenticity in the ocean of spectacle. She never knew that someone did see, someone understood, someone loved her in a way the world could never know. The days blurred into nights, routines replaced moments, and the illusion of control masked the erosion of their lives. Elvis's performances remained precise, controlled, flawless, but inside him grew a quiet desperation. He understood what was happening to Marilyn, recognized the signs that the world ignored, but remained constrained. Each headline reporting her troubles tightened the grip of inevitability, and each award celebrating her beauty reminded him of what would never be. Time, opportunity, and circumstance had conspired to keep them apart, and every passing day made intervention impossible. Love without expression, he realized, could be as painful as loss. The cost of restraint was now clear. His silence, meant as protection, had become part of the mechanism that left her exposed, vulnerable, and alone. Marilyn's isolation reached its peak. The fatigue of decades of performance, public scrutiny, and unrelenting expectation weighed upon her like a physical force. Trust became dangerous, relationships transactional, and emotional honesty impossible. Sleep offered no sanctuary. Fame, once intoxicating, now suffocated. She sought escape in routine, in rituals, in fleeting moments of privacy, but each relief was temporary. Her body, mind, and spirit bore the scars of a life celebrated but never understood. She moved through appearances as if walking underwater, her laughter a mask, her smiles a survival tactic. Every human connection failed to reach her, and every public adoration failed to nourish her. She needed understanding, and it never arrived. She needed love, and it never revealed itself in the form she required. And silently, somewhere in the background of her life, a man loved her in a way she would never know.
Elvis felt the tragedy of this dynamic acutely. He imagined a moment where he could have reached out, a moment to save, to comfort, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. But fear, timing, circumstance, and a lifetime of public scrutiny had chained him to silence. He knew that love left unspoken was no less real, yet it was powerless to change reality. The more he observed, the more he understood the fragility of the human heart and the cruelty of a world that rewarded brilliance and punished vulnerability. And yet he remained, performing, adored, and contained, while the woman he loved suffered unknowingly, invisibly, tragically. The final days approached without drama in the eyes of the world, but with profound, silent inevitability behind closed doors. Marilyn's exhaustion became unbearable.
She was surrounded by attention, by people, by expectation, but no one delivered what she needed most: recognition of her inner reality, someone willing to acknowledge her human fragility beyond the mask. Medical interventions, brief friendships, and fleeting moments of laughter could not offset the weight of constant pressure and the absence of authentic support. The world had adored her body, her smile, her charm, but it had failed to see the human being beneath. The culmination of decades of isolation, pressure, and misunderstanding was a quiet collapse that nobody prevented and nobody understood. Elvis never knew the moment she fell into the void from which she would not return. His world, still perfectly maintained, remained separate. He performed for the masses, celebrated publicly, and continued with routines that protected his own life. Yet privately, in the spaces where he allowed himself reflection, he carried the weight of unspoken love, imagining what could have been, haunted by the knowledge that he had been powerless despite understanding. Every headline, every retrospective story, every tribute reminded him that he had loved someone who died without ever knowing. The irony of fame, the capacity to be seen by millions while remaining invisible to the one who mattered most, was a cruel lesson in restraint and loss. Marilyn's death was abrupt to the public, shocking, and mourned universally. Tributes poured in, stories were written, and her legend grew. But the private tragedy, the fact that someone had loved her quietly, purely, profoundly, and that she had never known it, remained invisible. Elvis's grief was private, unacknowledged, unshared. The silence that had once felt protective now became a reminder of irreversible consequence. He carried the memory, the regret, and the love forward, knowing that the intensity of what was left unsaid could never be reconciled. A connection that might have altered both lives remained forever unrealized. In the end, the story of their relationship was not one of action, passion, or scandal, but of restraint, observation, and a tragedy defined by absence. Elvis's performances continued, and he remained adored, yet there was an emptiness in his quiet moments that the world never noticed. Marilyn's absence became a shadow in his life, a reminder of the silence that had defined them both. He understood that some human experiences could not be captured in fame, fortune, or public acclaim. Love, unexpressed, could haunt more profoundly than any loss seen or reported. He never spoke of it publicly. He never tried to explain the depth of the connection that had existed in invisibility. And in that silence, he preserved the truth of his devotion, the reality of his heartbreak, and the knowledge that he had loved someone with a depth the world would never witness. The story of Elvis and Marilyn concluded not with scandal, nor with reconciliation, but with the quiet tragedy of what remained unspoken. One loved silently, one suffered without knowing, and the world witnessed only the spectacle, the fame, and the brilliance. History remembered their faces, their talent, and their myth, but not the human, vulnerable connection that existed behind the scenes. That connection, the love unshared, the understanding unspoken, the tragedy invisible, was the final truth of their story.
Elvis loved her in silence. Marilyn died without knowing, and the quiet pain of what could have been lingered far longer than any applause. It remained, timeless, unseen, unforgettable, a shadow behind their legend, and a reminder that even among the brightest stars, human hearts can endure loss no one else perceives. The narrative of their lives was forever intertwined, not by events or words, but by the spaces left empty, the silences they could not cross, and the love that remained unspoken, immortal, and tragically alone.
Time had folded itself around the lives of Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, bending moments into years and stretching distance into permanence. By now, the patterns of isolation, fame, and unspoken connection had solidified into something nearly unchangeable. Elvis continued performing, adored by millions, celebrated for a voice and presence that the world could quantify, yet privately haunted by a quiet regret. Every stage, every applause, every public acknowledgement reminded him of the invisible bond he carried, of love he had never expressed, of care that had never been received. The silence, once a shield, had grown into a weight that pressed on his chest in the quiet hours, a constant reminder of the chasm between desire and possibility. Marilyn's life, in parallel, was at a tipping point. She moved through her obligations with practiced grace, yet the cracks beneath her brilliance had deepened. Each day required energy she no longer possessed in reserve. Her mind and body strained against the relentless expectations of fame, each smile and laugh a fragile mask over exhaustion, doubt, and fear. No one intervened, no one saw past the surface. She longed for someone who understood not her image, but her reality, and yet that understanding remained silent, invisible, residing in a man who could not act. The cruel symmetry of their situation was nearly perfect. He saw and understood. She needed and did not know. The world applauded the surface while ignoring the fractures underneath. Elvis's restraint, habitual and deliberate, now felt like its own tragedy. He had loved in silence for years, protecting the intimacy of his emotions from exposure, fearing the consequences of action in a world that valued spectacle above sincerity. Yet restraint was no longer comfort. Every headline hinting at her struggles, every whispered report, every missed opportunity gnawed at him. The realization settled in. Love unexpressed, no matter how genuine, could still hurt, could still be powerless, could still arrive too late. Marilyn's exhaustion was reaching its zenith. The relentless demands of visibility left her vulnerable in ways no one around her could perceive or prevent. She sought fleeting comfort in small routines and private moments, but these were insufficient against the cumulative weight of years under the public gaze. The more she performed, the more the gap widened between who she was and what the world required. Isolation was not physical, it was systemic, emotional, invisible, yet devastating. She began to perceive the world not as a place of opportunity, but as a trap designed to exploit brilliance while ignoring need. Elvis recognized these signs before anyone else, understanding the fragility of her situation with an intimacy reserved for those who truly see. Yet action remained impossible. His fear, his obligations, his own fragile containment, all prevented him from intervening.
The love he carried was both the most authentic thing in his life and the most impotent. Every imagined gesture ended in hesitation. Every mental reach across the void found only emptiness. Time had conspired against them. Opportunity had already begun its slow retreat. The irony of their situation was profound. He could feel her vulnerability from afar, could witness the erosion of her energy and spirit, yet he could not cross the invisible boundaries that fame, fear, and circumstance had erected. She, in turn, never perceived the depth of his care. The universe had orchestrated a tragedy in which understanding existed only in one direction. His love was unshared, her suffering unrecognized. Both endured under the weight of expectations they had never asked for, and both carried burdens that no one else could comprehend. In private moments, Elvis reflected on what might have been. A single word, a quiet message, a gesture of support could have altered trajectories. Yet in those reflections, he understood that timing, circumstance, and the momentum of fame made any intervention perilous. Even the possibility of reaching her safely and meaningfully felt unattainable. Each hesitation, though protective in intent, had become another layer in a tragedy neither could escape. He recognized that restraint could not save her, that understanding alone was insufficient, and that silence, once a shield, had hardened into an instrument of loss. Marilyn's daily life continued under the same unyielding gaze. She was surrounded, adored, and celebrated, yet profoundly alone in ways that mattered. The people closest to her provided logistics and appearances, not understanding or solace. Every smile and performance exacted a cost on her spirit, and each attempt at human connection faltered under the weight of expectation and misunderstanding. She existed in a paradox, seen by millions, invisible to the one person whose recognition would have truly mattered. Elvis's awareness of this dynamic brought no relief. Each day was a mirror of what could not be changed. He continued to move through his own career, sustaining the image, the performances, and the adoration, yet internally he carried a private ache. He understood the cruelty of circumstance, love unspoken, care invisible, and opportunity perpetually missed.
The realization haunted him, but he remained disciplined. The tragedy of restraint had become a constant companion. By the end of this period, the emotional distance between them had solidified into permanence. Circumstance, fear, fame, and unspoken understanding had converged to create a space that neither could cross. Elvis continued silently, Marilyn continued suffering unknowingly. The world around them applauded brilliance without comprehension, celebrated glamour without empathy, and observed surface appearances while missing the depths of their shared invisible narrative. The silence between them, layered over years, had become a defining element of their story. It was a silence heavier than any applause, more enduring than any fame, and infinitely more tragic than any public misunderstanding. Elvis's love existed in parallel with Marilyn's suffering, but never intersected with it. Both were bound to a pattern of expectation and inaction that left tragedy inevitable.
The lessons of restraint, timing, and circumstance had reached their cruelest conclusion. Understanding alone could not prevent disaster, and affection alone could not rescue what was slipping away. Their story, now entering its final act, would be defined not by what they achieved publicly, but by what was lost privately, invisibly, silently. The world mourned Marilyn Monroe in 1962, celebrating her beauty, her charm, and her unmatched charisma, yet missing the truth that lay beneath. She had lived in a universe designed to admire, but not to understand, to reward spectacle while ignoring fragility, to adore surface brilliance while neglecting the human heart. Every photograph, every headline, every obituary captured her image, yet none captured her silent struggle, her exhaustion, her quiet longing for understanding that never arrived. She left the world with a smile immortalized in pictures, a laughter echoed in film, a legacy of glamour and myth, but the truth of her loneliness remained invisible. Elvis Presley, far away from the cameras, far from public scrutiny in the moments he allowed for reflection, carried the weight of unspoken love. He had loved her for years, quietly, invisibly, carefully. He had recognized her struggles, understood the depth of her exhaustion, sensed the fragility that surrounded her life, yet never found a way to reach her. His love had been a vigil, a silent dedication, a constant observation from afar. He knew he could not intervene safely, that any attempt might destabilize what little structure both their lives had maintained. And yet, the restraint that had preserved him now felt like a haunting. The knowledge that someone could have been saved, or at least comforted, by a word, a gesture, a simple acknowledgement, tormented him endlessly. The irony was profound. He understood her pain better than anyone, yet she remained unaware of it. She had needed empathy, love, and recognition, but he had been constrained by circumstance and caution. Silence, meant to protect, had transformed into an instrument of tragedy. His private mourning had begun even before the news reached the public. He replayed the moments he never had, imagined the words he never spoke, and carried in his chest the weight of a love that could never be reciprocated, never be acknowledged, never be shared. Marilyn's death did not come as a spectacle. It was quiet, sudden, invisible to most, but inevitable for those who could see beneath the surface. Her body had endured the weight of expectation too long, her spirit eroded by years of performance under scrutiny, her mind fatigued from surviving the world's demands without the support it refused to provide. No one intervened, not because they were indifferent, but because the signs had been subtle, the cries inaudible to ears unwilling to listen. Fame had created an illusion of protection that never existed. Love had existed silently, but in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Elvis Presley's grief was private, profound, and unrelenting. The public observed the loss of an icon. He observed the loss of a woman he had loved quietly, endlessly, invisibly. Every headline became a reminder of what had been missed, every tribute a reflection of absence rather than presence. The silence he had maintained, which once felt wise and protective, now felt like an eternal barrier that could never be crossed. Love unexpressed, he realized, could endure long after the person it was meant for was gone, but endurance without acknowledgement was agony. He remembered moments he had imagined but never acted upon, reaching out through a simple letter, a quiet note, a fleeting message, a smile in private. Each possibility had dissolved under the weight of fear, circumstance, and timing. He had restrained himself to preserve order, to prevent scandal, to follow the rules of the world he inhabited. But those rules had not saved her. They had only ensured that tragedy unfolded silently, invisibly, irreversibly. The full cruelty of fame, timing, and restraint revealed itself too late. Marilyn had died without ever knowing that someone had loved her so profoundly, so quietly, and so consistently. She had lived surrounded by millions, yet emotionally abandoned in ways that mattered most. The brilliance admired by the world had concealed exhaustion. The laughter adored by the world had concealed despair. The public love of her image had concealed the absence of intimate, understanding presence. The tragedy of her life was not only in the pressure she endured, but in the absence of recognition of her humanity, the absence of understanding, the absence of someone who had been there quietly all along. Elvis's love, restrained and unseen, now existed only as memory and silence. He could perform, be celebrated, and command stages, but no accolade, no applause, no triumph could bridge the chasm left by her absence. He realized that silence had a weight beyond any stage, any song, any public performance. It could preserve, protect, and hide, but it could also haunt, torment, and amplify loss. He had loved her in the way he knew he could, carefully, silently, invisibly, but the timing and circumstance had made it insufficient. Love alone could not rescue. Understanding alone could not intervene. Silence alone, even with devotion, could not prevent tragedy. And so, the story of their lives concluded not with reconciliation, not with dramatic confession, not with cinematic closure. It concluded with reality. One loved in silence, the other suffered unknowingly, and the world celebrated brilliance without understanding. Their lives, forever intertwined in unspoken connection, became a lesson in restraint, timing, and the consequences of what is left unsaid. The tragedy of unexpressed affection and unseen suffering endured beyond the lives of those who carried it. Elvis Presley would continue, forever carrying the weight of silent devotion. Marilyn Monroe would be remembered, forever admired, yet forever unaware of the depth of love that had shadowed her life. In the end, fame preserved images, but could not preserve souls. Beauty, talent, and public admiration could not heal loneliness, could not substitute for understanding, and could not prevent tragedy. Silence, even when loving, could not bridge the gap of time, circumstance, and human fragility. Elvis loved her in silence. Marilyn died without knowing, and the shadow of what might have been lingered, eternal and invisible, a reminder that even amidst lights, applause, and legends, the deepest human stories often unfold where no one is watching, and the most profound love remains unspoken, tragic, and eternal.